I Hate Politics is a podcast about a human activity we love to hate. I am Sunil Dasgupta. Finally, the counting of votes for the Democratic primary in July 2022 has ended, and we know that incumbent Mark Elrich is 42 votes ahead of challenger David Blair. Since the margin of victory is less than 0.25%, there will be a county-paid full recount. In Montgomery County, as in many other one-party jurisdictions, the primary election is more consequential than the general election. Any real contestation happens there. The viable policy choices are there. It should be a big deal. But only 20% of the electorate and less than 35% of registered Democrats end up voting in the elections. I talked to veteran journalist Lou Peck about the implications of the primary elections, which on the face of it seems like a repeat of the 2018 county executive matchup between Elrich and Blair, which was also decided very narrowly.
Oh, had I a golden thread and needle oh, so fine, I'd weave a magic band of rainbow design, of rainbow design. In it I would weave the bravery of women.
If you're new to the show, I Hate Politics is a podcast about our neighborhoods, workplaces, schools, and streets, and our local governments as they function in diverse and democratic societies. This means our politics are messy, dirty, sometimes corrupt, with often self-serving politicians. But no matter how much we may hate politics, we are never exempt from it, even when we refuse to participate. In fact, the purpose of politics is to keep society functioning precisely when we don't agree with each other, like now. It is my hope that this podcast will help those who feel left out reconnect in our local communities. Music for this episode comes from Montgomery County climate band, the Sunshiners. Kippen Martin on guitar and vocals, Rick Sullivan on vocals and guitar, and Jeffrey Weisner on the double bass. They released their first album, Endangered Species, on the podcast on Earth Day 2022.
Sorry world, through hand and heart and mind, hand and heart and mind. Far over the water, I'd reach my magic band to every.
Last week, as part of a program of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, Montgomery County conducted a heat mapping survey using residents as street scientists to collect data on temperature, humidity, location, and time. They used car-mounted heat sensors and covered 200 square miles out of the county's total land area of 500 square miles. Meanwhile, it turns out that some of the biggest heat islands in the county are artificial turf athletic fields, some of which are run by the county. According to Maryland Sierra Club, there are 45 locations with plastic turf fields making up close to 4 million square feet of land, which is about 91 acres. Of the 45 locations, 14 are controlled by MCPS, 22 are in private schools, 19 are in private clubs, including privately managed soccer leagues. Maryland National Capital Parks and Planning Commission has 4, City of Gaithersburg 2, County Recreation and Montgomery College have 1 each. Because the heat mapping sensors were car-borne, they would not have the opportunity to drive onto athletic fields. The county's heat mapping effort, therefore, likely excluded turf athletic fields. This misses a big opportunity to influence a very long-running debate between advocates of natural grass and advocates of turf fields. Families of athletes, coaches, and others connected with youth sports want artificial fields because they require less maintenance and allow for more playing time. Many serious athletes in the county have ambition of winning college scholarships in sports, and playing time is very important to them. Advocates of natural grass argue that these fields of plastic are environmental disasters, including creating the heat islands. Turf fields can sometimes be 40 to 50 degrees higher than surrounding natural grass and tree areas. Athletes routinely suffer from burns, orthopedic injuries, and possibly cancer from playing on them. They may need less maintenance, but must be replaced more often. The torn out plastic is then dumped in places where they remain forever, like plastic bottles. School districts, including MCPS, private schools, clubs, and leagues have generally sided with families of athletes because they have separate insulation and maintenance budgets. Public schools especially have different pots of money for capital and operating expenses. Capital spending is paid for often by the state or other capital fund, but operational expenses used for maintenance is a recurring burden. We have then a choice between environmental degradation and convenience and financing. The results of Montgomery County's heat mapping exercise will be available at the website heat.gov. There are several questions surrounding the time it took the Montgomery County Board of Elections to count all the ballots. 18 days by my count. Meanwhile, other jurisdictions were done fairly quickly. In 2020, when there were far more mail ballots, the county completed its vote counts within a few days. So what happened this time? Unlike in 2020, the Board of Elections could not start counting ballots until about 36 hours after the elections closed on July 19th. In 2020, using emergency rules, mail-in ballots were counted way before the actual election date. Since mail-in ballots can take more time to count, the postmark date needs to be checked, the signed oath needs to be verified, and voters often use a cross or a strike instead of filling in bubbles. Democrats, and especially Montgomery County Senator Cheryl Kagan, has blamed Governor Hogan for vetoing a bill that would have allowed early counting. Hogan has said that he objected to a provision in the bill to cure incorrectly filled ballots via text messaging. It is worth asking if a standalone bill on early counting alone would have won the governor's signature. It seems that the number of volunteers and the space available to the Board of Elections for counting was limited this time in part because the election was pushed back into the middle of July. It is unclear at this time how many volunteers were available this year and how that number compared to previous years. Requests to the board staff for details were not answered. Montgomery County Board of Election staff also decided to sort ballots by precinct, not just by date. This may have delayed the process a little bit, but in retrospect is likely to make the recount easier. Recount is expected to start August 18th, and it is unclear how long it will take to count the 170,000 ballots that need to be recounted. One thing is clear, however. The closeness of the county executive race has contributed to the long process. Had the margins been larger, like in the gubernatorial race, the board would have continued its counting, but public attention would have shifted away from a purely procedural function. Instead, the razor-thin recount-eligible margin is, in my view, the primary reason for why Montgomery County Board of Elections took as long as it did. I'll keep digging more and report back if I find something. The other thing that should be clear as well is that 170,000 votes is a small fraction of the total number of registered Democrats. And should the voter turnout increase in the future, will the Montgomery County Board of Elections be ready to count even more mail-in ballots? You're listening to I Hate Politics. I am Sunil Dasgupta. I'll be back with veteran journalist Lou Peck to talk about what the election results mean.
If you do, you will hear their voices calling across the years. They're calling across the ocean. Yeah, they're calling across the land. And they will till we all come to understand. None of us are free. None of us are free. None of us are free if one of us is chained. None of us are free. There are people still in darkness. Yeah, they just can't see the light. If you don't say it's wrong, then that says it's right.
Lou Peck, welcome back to I Hate Politics.
It's always a pleasure to be here.
The primary results from the July 2022 primary are out now. What does the primary tell us about politics in the county today?
Well, I think it's a little bit deceptive because if you look at the sort of the superficial results, if you will, and you see that in 2018, you had Mark Elrich with David Blair as the major, as the two leading candidates. Mark Elrich emerges by 77 votes as the winner. Here is, I think many of the listeners know, the initial count has been finished, and Mark Elrich, whether you want to just say he's ahead or whether he's the apparent winner in any event, there's going to be a certification sometime in the next few days showing him the winner by 42 votes. So one can say, all right, this is, seemingly a county divided down the middle, and nothing's really changed in 4 years. However, you look at the polling that was done over the course of the last year and showed Elrich in a fairly comfortable position, not overwhelming, but a comfortable position, while a lot of the polling, as you got closer to the primary this year and closer to early voting, started showing the race tightening significantly. What happened, you had one candidate, David Blair, who spent a record amount of money in 2018 and apparently will end up spending a record amount of money again in 2022, who this year went on the air in the closing 2 to 3 weeks of the campaign with a saturation ad campaign sharply criticizing the incumbent Mark Elrich, utilizing the endorsement of the Washington Post, which, as it did in 2018, endorsed Blair in 2022. This time, the Post did it in a way that really, I think, blistered Elrich. This is the first primary where, in a big way, you had independent expenditure players. There was a left-wing PAC supporting Elrich that attacked Blair in 2018 that spent maybe $100,000. My figures indicate Progressive Progress as of early July had spent something like $600,000. Raised $600,000 and spent $530,000. And then you had this PAC that sort of came out of the middle of nowhere that wasn't even in existence until a month before the primary. The Affordable Maryland PAC focused very heavily on the affordable housing issue we talked about earlier. That was, in part, $500,000 from some billionaire in San Francisco who had made his fortune off of Facebook. Another $250,000 from Charlie Nelson, who was the chair of the Progressive for Progress PAC, but also gave $250,000 for this Affordable Maryland PAC. Affordable Maryland PAC ran a bunch of ads, again, very heavily focused against Elrich. So, what does this say for the future? I think that independent expenditure campaigns are probably here to stay. And I know that there's some concern about some of the, I've heard from one person who I would call sort of one of the elder statesmen of the county, a concern about whether or not sort of politics as we've generally practiced it in Montgomery County, which has been a lower key affair and sort of practiced within certain limits, has sort of the old rule book has been thrown out both by for the presence of these independent expenditure PACs and the use of this attack campaign, such as the one that Blair mounted at the end. So I think that's a whole question for the future. And another one that I think it doesn't get to turnout, but it gets to sort of the level playing field is the issue of Tom Hooker, when he was running for county executive for a time, kept pointing out that public financing programs in other states, if you were a candidate who took public financing and some very wealthy person proceeded to self-fund the campaign, the public financing system would then in effect match what the self-financing person was spending. I'm not sure if Montgomery County wants to start matching $5 million campaigns going forward, but I think the issue of the fact that Hans Riemer and Mark Elrich, I think, raised somewhere between $1 million and $1.1 million this time, and spent about $1 million. And here you had David Blair, who's to equal or exceeded the 5.7 he spent in 2018, and 5.4 of it in 2018 kind of came out of his own pocket. At least $5 million this time came out of his own pocket. It does get to the issue of the playing field and getting your message out, and whether or not there will be any debate about going forward about ways to level that kind of playing field in the event that somebody with those kind of resources decides to get involved at this level.
But what about the politics itself? I mean, where were we in 2018, and has that changed? I guess I would go back to the fact that I've lived in this county for 35 years now, and every campaign that I can remember, going back to 1986 when my wife and I bought a house in Bethesda, there have been certain constants, particularly on economic development, where there's been this quadrennial debate, and invariably pitting a quote slow growth candidate versus a more pro-development candidate over the pace at which the county should grow. I think the difference between the 1980s and today is that I think there's a greater consciousness over the fact that as Virginia across the river is growing, you look at the Amazon headquarters that Montgomery County bid for and lost out to Arlington.
I think there's a consensus that yes, economic development has to happen from the standpoint of growing the tax base and maintaining a lot of services. Where in I think the 1980s and 1990s there was some thought about whether or not economic development was a good thing or not. I think everybody agrees it's a good thing. It's now more of a debate over, how to do this. And I think there you had some major differences between, I think, Elrich on one hand and Blair and Reamer on the other.
So, in terms of slow growth and pro-growth, you're drawing a line from 1986 to 2022. And over time, you're also at the same time suggesting that there is something of a consensus around the idea of growth, even if not the modality of growth, right? So can you say what is, in your view, the difference in terms of Elrich and Blair in particular, but also Reamer, about, what is the difference between them on this issue?
I think it's let's take the housing and housing affordability, which I think is, goes hand in hand with the whole question of growth. Mark Elrich, and he bristles at when his opponents call him a NIMBY, but this is a guy who has been in politics for 30 years in the county and has a history of courting a lot of the neighborhoods and a lot of the civic associations where there is nervousness about growth, be it economic development, be it housing, from the standpoint of changing the nature of what we know Montgomery County has been over the last 40 or 50 years, which is heavily a county of residential single-family neighborhoods. And then, I think he's always been protective of people who are concerned about that, which is where his opponents call him a NIMBY. He, on the other hand, will accuse his opponents of essentially, embracing, thinking that the free market can do everything. And I think in this case, again, going to the issue of housing affordability, I'll go back a little bit in advance of the campaign to 2019, 2020, when there was a major debate pitting Hans Reamer, who was getting ready to run for executive, against Elrich over so-called accessory dwelling units in neighborhoods, which I think was something of a microcosm of the whole question of to what degree there should be, if you will, upzoning of neighborhoods to accommodate more growth. Blair at various times expressed support for, upzoning to a certain degree. So I think that's where a lot of the, a lot of the fault lines tended to occur. And again, we're talking here about housing, but once again, if you're going to have economic growth and you want people to live in the county and you want a walkable community, you got to have some place to house them. And this gets back to sort of, if you will, the question of Montgomery County being a county where something like 50% of the county is zoned for single family housing.
I think it's 2 or 3% is open for actually multifamily housing.
Yeah, exactly. Which is where what I was going to mention earlier too was another flashpoint in this campaign, which continues to be debated and in the county council, is the so-called Thrive 2050 report, which talks about various options for, it talks about various ways to offer more options within existing neighborhoods in terms of duplexes and multiplexes and the like. And just as, again, historically, the people who have backed Mark Elrich have been very resistant or leery about this kind of development, you've seen a major debate and controversy break out with within neighborhoods among those who are more supportive of more options in traditional neighborhoods and those who want to keep the nature of those neighborhoods, be it worried about traffic, be it worried about, just overall quality of life. And I should mention that sort of as a subtext, you've had, on the one hand, the county executive race was Elrich on one side, I think, in terms of a view of economic development, and Blair and Reamer on the other. Arguably the most influential non-elected official in the county is the chairman of the planning board, Casey Anderson, who was been the force behind drafting Thrive 2050, and he and Elrich have, there's no love lost between the two of them, and they've been at loggerheads for years. So that is also, I think, infused this debate over the last couple of years.
The election results are only superficially close, right? Yeah. That in fact they are not. But on substantive issues such as economic development, housing, it does seem that it's like, one side wins one, the other side wins the other one. The one side wins one, the other side wins one. The pro-growth people got the ADU, but, didn't get the election. And so, it does seem like we are divided on a knife's edge.
Yeah. I think absent the results of the election, I think that you're correct, that there is still a major split in this county over, the issue of economic development. The point I was making in terms of sort of saying, of looking at 42 votes this time and 77 votes the last time, was the fact that if you looked at polls a year ago or even earlier this year, you would have seen Mark Elrich ahead of David Blair by a significant factor.
But those polls were done so much ahead of time that it's unclear whether people were focused on the election at all.
And yes, at the time there were a lot of people who were undecided, and clearly there were people who weren't that focused. One thing, sort of as an aside, that's interesting is that once people did get focused, there seems to have been a lot of interest, because I was just doing some numbers crunching yesterday. About 500 more people voted in the county executive election than voted in the gubernatorial election in Montgomery County. Oh. Usually in gubernatorial elections, you have, it's sort of where people will go to vote, and then there's a huge drop off as you get in the local elections. This was the opposite. There was actually, in both cases, I think it was about 140,000 people who voted, but several hundred people more actually did not vote in the gubernatorial and voted in the county executive race. My point, Sunil, is that in terms of the fact that, how do we get from 77 votes the last time to 42 votes this time? It went through a process where, you can't ignore the fact that for 2 years this county was in a virtual lockdown over COVID. Mark Elrich, in a lot of these polls last year and early on, got very high marks from rank and file voters over COVID. There was one poll, a private poll, was never released publicly, but it was sponsored by a coalition of labor groups in March, which asked the question, is the county going in the right direction or the wrong direction? And this is as of March. Something like 74-75% said right direction. When you think of national polls, which show about 20 to 25% of the country think we're headed in the right direction, 75% is rather astounding and would seem to presage the re-election of an incumbent. What I'm simply saying is I think that there were positives for Elrich that had very little to do with the, if you will, this continuing debate over economic development. Ultimately, I think these were eroded by the fact that the COVID pandemic has eased and you had this rat-a-tat-a-tat of negative advertising.
Well, so it seems that the campaigns then shifted the most prominent issue from being COVID to being economic development. It shifted the lens.
Yeah, I think without question, putting aside the issue of how focused rank and file voters were on a particular issue, I think in overall, yes, and it certainly shifted the lens from from COVID, particularly as COVID eased, to other issues. And I think that the Blair ad, which was running, as you know, nonstop in the last 2 to 3 weeks, very much played on his endorsement by the Washington Post, which, as I said earlier, that ad blistered Elrich on a number of fronts, one being economic development, but there were several others. So whether it was on economic development, whether it was on crime, whether it was on other issues, I should mention as well that I think crime. I sensed nervousness within the Elrich camp early on that the crime issue was going to hurt them as crime rose, not only here but is rising everywhere, and clearly that Blair attack ad playing on the Post editorial very prominently mentions crime as well. So yes, I think the lens was shifted. I'm not sure it was simply a question of shifting it from COVID to economic development. I think it was shifting it from COVID to a variety of issues that did not work well to Mark Elrich's advantage.
Okay, let's talk about turnout. You mentioned it a little bit. You said 140,000 people voted. How does it stack with the past? What is it? How do we stack with others? Certainly on the Democratic side, the electorate registered Democrats are upwards of 400,000. And so, 140 is, a small percentage. The primary is the consequential election in Montgomery County. That seems a problem about Democratic legitimacy.
Yeah. And actually, in preparation for our chat today, I did some numbers crunching yesterday, and the results are sort of jarring. Let me just sort of start out with the preliminaries. By my calculation, and I have not seen a formal number out of the Board of Elections, you had 141,499 voters voting in the county executive primary this time, which is, as I said earlier, the high water mark, about 500 more than the gubernatorial, out of about 407,500 Democrats on the active rolls. That's a turnout of about 34.7, close to 35%. That's approximately what it was in 2018. The good news in 2018 is it jumped significantly from 2014, where Ike Clegg was running for a third term. Duncan was trying to make a comeback, and the turnout was closer to 24, 25%. What I think is going to jar people is when you look at that 141,499, call it 141,500 who voted this year in the Democratic primary, and you look at the total number of active voters in the county, Democrats, Republicans, unaffiliated. Total number of active voters are now 670,000, almost 670,500.
Right.
You do the math, and it basically meant that this time the people who voted, that 21.1% of all active registered voters in the county voted in the Democratic primary for executive. Given the fact the Democratic primary for executive is tantamount to election in this county, right, it essentially means that about 20% of this of the voters in this county are determining who runs the county on a 4-year to 4-year kind of basis. And one thing I know, that a few years ago, particularly when you had the 77 vote margin between Blair and Elrich, it was thought that, given the small margin and given how few people ultimately had determined who was going to be the next county executive, there would be some debate over ways to try to remedy this. It really hasn't happened, outside of the fact that I know that there have been a couple of efforts by the Montgomery County legislative delegation to put in legislation that would enable, it would authorize, it would not impose ranked choice voting on Montgomery County, but it would give the Montgomery County Council the authorization to go ahead with ranked choice voting if they so choose. Unfortunately, the author is authorizing legislation in Annapolis has never gotten very far. When I've asked the reasons, I've been told on background from a number of legislators, it's just not something that the sort of the statewide powers that be are very enthusiastic about, because ranked choice voting, which as you know, is used in federal elections in Maine. It's used in several major cities, San Francisco and New York being the two most prominent examples I can think of. In this county, it's used in Tacoma Park municipal elections. Is a potential way to try to, if you will, be more inclusive. The problem, though, in a primary, if you're still going to limit the voting, if you're going to still have a system of Democratic primaries, you're going to limit voting to registered Democrats. Ranked choice voting, while applicable in a general election, is not going to make much difference in a primary, which then gets you into the debate over the advisability of so-called jungle primaries, which are used in a number of Western states, California and Washington State being two notable examples.
The Post, despite its significant efforts on behalf of David Blair, that endorsement did not carry well, and it seems that the Apple ballot made a comeback this in the primary. What is your view?
If you look at who the MCEA endorsed this time, and I'm trying to recall. I believe that if I'm not mistaken, actually in two of the three districts, I believe that I think District 1 and District 3, the Apple ballot endorsee was the clear winner. I think in District 5, where I think the Apple ballot endorsed, the person who got the Apple ballot endorsement and the incumbent are in a neck and neck kind of situation. And the MCEA, for whatever reason, decided to stay out of the at-large race this time. So the incumbent, I think last I saw, was ahead with like 55%. So I think it's a mixed bag. I think there were two. You can say there were two races where the Apple ballot clearly made a difference. There was one that, jury's still out, if you will, in terms of the runoff. Another one where they sort of sat it out, and so it's hard to tell what the impact is there. I do think that I know one frustration. I think you're well aware of this because you were running that year. In 2020 was that, given the fact that with COVID and how limited in-person polling was, or in-person voting, there were limited opportunities to pass out the Apple ballot. I think, and limited people to utilize. I don't know exactly what the distribution at the polls was of the Apple ballot this year. I suspect it was, more significant than it was in 2020, only because of the fact that more people were voting in person as opposed to the height of the pandemic, where in 2020. One other observation, I think, in terms of the Apple ballot, there were a number of people who feel that in 2018 it made a particular difference because, well, you had 33 at-large candidates running for the county council, and people just sort of threw up their hands. And I think we're looking for any kind of guidance. And I think, therefore, the Apple ballot that year may have made something of a comeback. If I'm not mistaken, off the top of my head, I'd have to go back and double check, but I believe for the at-large, if putting aside the Board of Education, Mark Elridge had the Apple ballot endorsement this time. He appears to have won narrowly, pending a recount. I believe that all four at-large county council nominees, the three incumbents, plus Lori Ann Sales, were all Apple ballot endorsements. So, the Apple ballot was arguably 4-for-4 in the county council at large race, even though there were only 8 candidates this time as opposed to 33 last time. I'm not sure. I don't have the Apple ballot endorsements in front of me in terms of the district races, so I'm not quite sure of the scorecard there. But I mean, I think suffice it to say that overall, while there's debate as to whether the Apple ballot continues to have the kind of impact that it that it once did. And just like this debate over whether the post endorsement continues to have the influence it once did, I think the consensus is that if there are, for the average candidate in Montgomery County, if the endorsement you're looking for remain the post and the Apple ballot / the MCEA, with I think the Sierra Club, probably running in something in third place, only because this is such a county of such environmental consciousness. That having been said, the endorsement of David Blair by the Sierra Club in this election caused a significant amount of controversy.
What do you think happened in the council elections, the county council elections?
In the 9-member council that is now sitting and will be sitting till December, you had all of one woman. The women got shut out in 2018 in the at-large race, where you had 33 people. This time you had one woman winning an at-large seat, and I believe 5 of the 7 district races are council seats will be held by women. So there was a sharp increase from 1 to 6. Women will be a majority. In terms of breaking down the results of the council race, sort of getting away from the question of sort of minority representation, women representation, goes back to what we were talking about earlier, where you had Mark Elrich on one side and the council on the other over the last 4 years on a number of pieces of legislation dealing with economic development.
Do you expect that to change?
If Mark Elrich is the next county executive, probably not, because I think the next council is probably going to have a majority that is going to be similar to the mindset of the current council. You look at the so-called Progressives for Progress PAC. Yeah, I know the name created some, cackles around the county, and there was some backlash, where a number of candidates got up, particularly Black candidates got up in Silver Spring and protested their endorsements. But you look at who they endorsed. They endorsed 2 of the at-large county council candidates and 5 of the at-large at the district candidates who won this time had the endorsement were part of the slate of Progressives for Progress.
Lou Peck, thank you for coming on I Hate Politics. Please come back.
Thank you. Always a pleasure. Talk to you soon.
Yes, my daddy was a miner. I'm gonna be a sunshiner. My granddaddy was a miner. I'm gonna be a sunshiner. Ever since they closed the mine, ain't too much to do.
That was veteran journalist Lou Peck. We will bring further lessons from primary 2022 as we arrive at them. The election may be over, but almost all the electeds are now on record on the podcast addressing key issues they will have to make decisions on. And these interviews remain important for those who want to understand the evolution of politics, especially at the county level, where information is not as easily available as it may be, for example, for Congress members. That's all for this episode. You've been listening to I Hate Politics. I am Sunil Dasgupta. Music for this episode comes from Montgomery County climate band, the Sunshiners. Kip and Martin on guitar and vocals, Rick Sullivan on vocals and guitar, and Jeffrey Weisner on the double bass. They released their first album, Endangered Species, on the podcast on Earth Day 2022. If you want to share your music on the show or know someone else who might want to, please email us at ihppod@gmail.com or reach out on Twitter at ihppod. I hope you will subscribe and share the podcast as we bring you stories about politics close to you and to your home. See you next time.
Built myself a pretty little house, generator out back as quiet as a mouse. Got me a job and there ain't none finer, going round being a sunshiner. Yes, my daddy was a miner. I'm gonna be a sunshiner. My granddaddy was a miner. I'm gonna be a sunshiner. 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 Sunshiner.